We had spent a good portion of the book of Genesis taking a good look at the father of faith, the father of a multitude, and that was Abraham. Abraham is the father of the Jews. In fact, we were first introduced to Abraham at the end of Genesis chapter 11. And now we find ourselves in chapter 29, some 237 years after the birth of Abraham. Abraham was 100 years old when he and Sarah had their son, Isaac. And Isaac was 60 years old when he and Rebekah had their son, Jacob. And if you'll remember from our last study that Jacob had left the house of his father Isaac for fear that his twin brother Esau would make good on his promise to kill Jacob over the birthright and the blessing that Jacob had managed to steal away from Esau. So Jacob had ventured now back to his mother's family, back to Haran in Mesopotamia. And Jacob is now 77 years old when he begins his venture. The focus through the rest of the book of Genesis deals now with Jacob and with his sons. It's not until Genesis chapter 49, the second to the last chapter in the book of Genesis, that Jacob passes on to be with his fathers, Abraham and Isaac, or he dies. The book ends in chapter 50. So I feel like I kind of gave the ending away. I guess I'm the spoiler here. But listen, everyone dies, okay? Just letting you know. But for now, Jacob has no wife, no home, no family to take along for his travel. Jacob is really a fugitive, fleeing from Beersheba to Bethel, and then from Bethel towards Haran. In Genesis chapter 29 and verse 1, it reads, "Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the east, and he looked, and behold, a well in the field. And lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. And thither were all the flocks gathered. And they rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in its place. And Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be ye? Or, where do you guys come from? And they said, Of Haran are we. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. And Jacob said, Lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go and feed them. Or what he's saying is, look, it's still broad daylight, and it's still too early to go and round up the animals, so why don't you water the sheep and the goats so they can go back out to pasture? And they said, We cannot, until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from the well's mouth, then we water the sheep. Now, we had read before that Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. And even though he was a homebody, Jacob isn't a shy person. He's not timid with these men that he encounters by this well of fresh water in the land of Haran. I believe that Jacob had a certain confidence in the Lord that he picked up back there at Bethel. Remember, the Lord had just given Jacob dreams at Bethel about an access or a stairway to heaven. We call it Jacob's ladder. Visions of heaven certainly help us through any circumstances that we might face here on earth. And I like the conversation that he has about Laban with these men. Jacob knew that this is where the tents of Laban were. And so he asked the men, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And I imagine that their response was pretty dull. We know him. And that's why he asked them again, is he well? He is well. See, Laban is their boss. Soon he's going to be Jacob's boss also. So you'll see why they're so unenthused about any conversation that had to do with Laban. So they turn the conversation in the direction of Rachel. Look, man, here comes Laban's daughter, Rachel. And in verse 9 it reads, and while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. So Rachel is a shepherdess. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father, which means that they were cousins. Now, Jacob seems to be a pretty emotional fellow in this encounter. From the story, we know that Rachel was a beautiful woman, as was Sarah and Rebekah, Jacob's mother and his grandmother. So it's understandable that Jacob would give Rachel a kiss. But I believe that this is more of a greeting than it was a romantic smooch. But then he begins to cry, very loudly is what it reads. And I believe that this was because he came here to Padan Aram, not only to escape the hand of Esau, his twin brother, but also to seek a wife for himself. And the first woman he meets by the well was this beautiful young damsel named Rachel. I can imagine all those years that Jacob had watched his brother Esau married to a couple of the Hittite women, that Jacob himself, he felt very alone. But he'd rather be alone than to have an ungodly wife in the land of Canaan. And here, by the side of this well of fresh water, Jacob knows that these women in the house of Laban, they're godly women. And the prospect of him taking one of these beautiful, godly women for a bride, well, it was enough to make him cry. And he did cry. Loudly is what it says. And Rachel ran off to tell her father of Jacob. She said, there's another man from the house of Abraham and Isaac standing by the well. I think that Laban's excitement would have been much like it was some 80 years ago or so. His thought may have been, I do remember the gold bracelets and the golden earrings. A man by the well, huh? Verse 13, and it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into the house, and Jacob told Laban of all these things. And Laban said unto him, surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. Now, Laban knew that Abraham and Isaac were both wealthy men. And it sounds like Laban is ready to marry Jacob himself. He tells him, you are my flesh and my bone. But really, Jacob didn't have anything but the clothes on his back and maybe one very tired camel from the journey. And I believe that during this month stay here, that Jacob offers his services to Laban for a time. I don't know if he told him about the stolen blessing, but I would say probably not. But he did offer himself to Laban as a hired hand. Verse 15, and Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And so they made the deal for Rachel. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love that he had for her. Nowadays, when a man wants to take a bride, he'll ask her out on a date, and then they'll become boyfriend and girlfriend until he proposes. And he gives her an engagement ring, and they set a date for the wedding ceremony. If he's a respectable man, he'll ask her father and her mother for their daughter's hand in marriage, so that not only will he get their approval, but he'll get their blessing as well. I know Justin, our youth leader, had just asked the father and the mother for their permission and for the blessing so that he could court their daughter, Susie. They're actually here sitting right in the back. And I believe that the parents said yes. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be sitting together over there. And Justin is a blessed young man. But in these ancient times in the Middle East, if a man spotted a bride, or his bride, then he may not even go and speak to the damsel first, but he would go straight to her father and ask the father for her hand in marriage. And if you guys haven't seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, then I would encourage all of you guys to watch that movie. It's a great movie. Now, if the father, if he gave permission, he would ask the young man for a bride price for the marriage, or for her hand in marriage. The bride price is much like a dowry. The dowry was what the father of the bride was to pay to the groom and his family. It was money up front given to the groom in case the marriage went bad. And this money would ensure that she stayed in the man's house rather than returning her back to her father's house. A dowry is still offered today in areas such as India and Pakistan. There's actually a concern today for the safety of the bride. And a dowry is paid by the bride's family so that if the marriage does go bad, they won't kill her or make her a slave. So the dowry today might just save her life. Believe me, Christianity has helped every single culture that's embraced its values to give equality to women, to people in general. Many places like India and Pakistan and other places in the Middle East have such a low view of women in society that they view them as being disposable property rather than created in the image of God and being precious unto the Lord. Now, the bride's price was much like the dowry, but it was money given to the father of the bride that had come from the groom. And this was a type of alimony up front, just in case the marriage went bad, and she was returned again to her father. Then the father would have this money saved for her to provide for her until she could marry again. It's almost like apology money. Sorry it didn't work out, Dad, but here she is. After all, I did pay the bride price. And if the marriage worked out, which you would want it to, if it worked out, then Dad could just keep this money, and that's why many fathers would take this bride price. So the deal for Rachel, the bride price, ended up being what Jacob had proposed to Laban. Laban didn't set the bride price, but Jacob did. And if you ask me, I think that he paid an arm and a leg for Rachel. 7 years of labor for the hand of Rachel as his bride. This is a man who's in love. This is an offer that any father just couldn't refuse. And Laban says, 7 years, huh? You got yourself a deal, young man. Well, he was 77 years old. And you got to love verse 20, which reads, And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had for her. You know, love has this way of putting people out of their minds. It's as if they lose all their senses over the one that they're in love with. Once a person's in love, it's very hard to talk them down off that ledge. They're ready to jump, and there's not anything that anybody's going to do about it. I remember that when I was in the second year of Calvary Chapel School of Ministry, when I met my beautiful wife, Anna, that we fell in love right away. And this was in September at the beginning of my second year. And my grades, they went from straight A's. I'm not trying to brag, it's just what it was. There were straight A's in my first year, and then they were C's and D's in my second year. Because of love, because I was in love. It was a good trade. You know, when Justin doesn't show up on time, I just always tell John, he's in love. Just, you know, he has an excuse. He's in love, all right? Sorry, Justin. Albert Einstein explains love by saying that if you put your hand on a hot stove for just 1 minute, it seems like an hour. But if you sit and talk with a pretty girl for just 1 hour, it seems like a minute. And that, my friend, is relativity. Now, there are 2 daughters mentioned here in the story. Jacob has met the younger one first, and he has his eye on Rachel, the younger. But Leah was another choice, as both girls were still unmarried. It reads that Leah was tender-eyed, and those 2 words could be translated faint in appearance, which means that there may have been something wrong with her eyes physically, or that she just wasn't all that pleasant to look at, or even both. Verse 17 in the New Living Translation reads, There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Great translation. So there's a contrast of beauty between the 2 girls. So the days of Jacob's labor were over. He had spent the time and served his full 7 years, and I'm sure because of his love that he was marking the calendar every single day for Rachel. In verse 21 it reads, And Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of that place and made a feast. So he says, not so fast. We're going to have a wedding celebration first. And it came to pass in the evening that Laban took Leah his daughter and brought her to him. And Jacob went in unto her. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah his maid for an handmaid. Now, Leah must have been wrapped up in a bunch of veils and clothing. And usually the marriage was consummated with a night of intimacy between the couple within a tent that would be prepared for the bride and the groom. And this tent would have been right next door to the wedding celebration. We'll see later on in the book of Leviticus that one reason for this is so that the father could prove the purity of his daughters if it was ever questioned later on by the husband. I also believe that Jacob may have had a bit of wine at this celebration, so his senses may not have been working very well. On this night, when he thinks he's being blessed with the one daughter, but he gets tricked into the blessing of another daughter. That would be Leah, without knowing it. Of course, this sounds very much like Jacob's own deception against his father Isaac, when Jacob had stolen the blessing for himself. There's a bit of poetic justice here as Laban switches daughters, just like Rebekah, his own sister, had switched sons back in the tents of Isaac. And I really don't believe that Laban thinks very much of this deception at all, since he gives Leah a handmaid by the name of Zilpah, which was custom for a bride leaving her father's house to have a maiden as an assistant. It's like he just signs away the marriage certificate on Leah before Jacob even has a chance to object. And poor Leah. She knew she wasn't very attractive, but she had to do what her father Laban had commanded her to do. And Rachel also had to wait for Dad's scheming. This mess, it doesn't get much better after this. One thing that I noticed again is that Jacob doesn't pray. In fact, you don't see that he prayed once during this whole 7 years. He's just driven by his passion for Rachel. Whether he prayed or not, I'm sure he did, but it just doesn't say. But what it does say is that when he paid his dues, he demanded his reward. And he got much more than he bargained for. In verse 25, it reads, "And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah." You know, I think that the saddest thing is that poor Leah had to see the disappointment on Jacob's face. And he said to Laban, "What is this that thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? You deceived me, man." And Laban said, "It must not be so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years." And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel his daughter to wife also, and Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah his handmaid to be her maid. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. So Laban pulls the old switcheroo on Jacob. If Jacob was mad, or if Jacob had felt cheated or deceived when Laban had mentioned the right of the firstborn, I think that right then and there, any ill feelings that Jacob had against Laban were obviously humbled. Jacob must have been very humbled, since we don't see him complaining one bit after Laban tells him it's custom to bless the firstborn first. And after you have fulfilled your week of consummation with Leah, then you can have Rachel. And I'm going to add another 7 years to the price of Rachel. You know, Laban, he drives a hard bargain, doesn't he? Because he knows that Jacob will practically do anything to win Rachel as his bride. That's how much he loves her. And Laban knows it. Also, Jacob, he better not make too much of a fuss about this situation, or he just might find himself out the door, down the road with Leah only. So for the love of Rachel, Jacob complies. This man is in love. You know, from verse 20, the English word love, the word that's used for Jacob's love for Rachel, It's a different Hebrew word than the word that's mentioned back in 27, which was the love that described Isaac's feelings for the venison that his son Esau had cooked for him. Isaac said, "Make me some savory meat, such as I love." Well, this is a different word. And it's used mostly for a man's commitment to a woman. It's used also, though, for David's love for Jonathan, which means that it's not just a sensual love, but it speaks more of a love that's deeply committed to. I like this word for love. David loved Jonathan as a man loves his own soul, is how it reads. And this word is used to describe God's love for the nation of Israel also. God is committed to them, to Israel, his son. And I believe that Jacob had found his match in Rachel. But Jacob had also met his match in Laban. I mean that if Jacob and Rachel were soulmates in marriage, then Jacob and Laban were soulmates in deception. Like I said, Laban seems to have gotten the better of Jacob for now. The deceiver has been out-deceived. But Jacob was a pretty good sport about the whole thing, and he complied because he loved Rachel. And so he spends the next 7 years in his own tent with Rachel, because he got her after the week was over, while poor Leah had to dwell in her own tent next door to them. She was treated more like a handmaid than a wife. In verse 31 it reads, "And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben." She may have gotten pregnant within the first week of marriage. So she named her son, "Behold a son." Reuben means, "Behold the son." For she said, "Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me." And there's that word love again. Leah knew that she wasn't loved. And she wanted Jacob to be committed to her also as much as he was committed to Rachel. Now, we've seen it a couple times already in the book of Genesis, but here's another case of polygamy. You guys know what polygamy is, right? Polygamy is the marriage union of one man to multiple wives. God created them as one male and one female from the beginning, and God's design was that men and women would stay virgins until they marry, and then that they would be monogamous for life, or stay faithful to just that one person for life. And all the men in the Bible who had multiple wives had multiple problems as a direct result of having more than one wife. And Jacob's problems are just beginning. Verse 33, "And Leah conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon." Simeon means heard. "And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 times. Therefore was his name called Levi." And Levi means joined to. "And she conceived again, and bare a son. And she said, Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, and she left bearing." In the last few verses of chapter 29, Leah believes that her sons will win the heart of Jacob, so that he'll want to dwell with her in her tent rather than dwelling in the tent of Rachel all the time. And she names her sons according to this desire for her husband's affections. Reuben means I have gotten you a son, Jacob, so love me already. Simeon means, Jacob, God has heard me, so love me already. And then Levi means join to, which is another cry from Leah. Won't you dwell with me? Won't you be joined to me in my tent, Jacob? Won't you love me already? And this is getting kind of sad. To be a wife that's not loved by her husband is a sad thing. Leah couldn't help it if she wasn't as attractive as her sister Rachel was. She wanted Jacob's love also. And I do like the fact that Leah credits the Lord for all of her sons. If you notice that this story doesn't find any one of these folks calling upon the name of the Lord, except for Leah. In verse 32, she says that the Lord has seen my affliction and has given me a son. In verse 33, she says that the Lord has given me a second son to win Jacob. And in verse 34, she seems to be a little bit more obsessed over Jacob and doesn't mention the Lord of all. She just says that Levi shall surely join my husband to me. And then when she bears again and names her son Judah, it's as though she almost says, forget Jacob already. God has given me 4 sons, and the 4th son, Judah, his name means praise. Forget about that absent husband of mine. Praise the Lord. I love that. You know, the Messiah, Christ Jesus, would come through the loins of Judah. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So Christ would come through Leah and not through Rachel. Even if Jacob didn't pay any attention to his wife Leah, God certainly did. In Genesis 30 and verse 1, it reads, And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So now this is becoming a competition between these two sisters. I think love and even fair play have just been thrown out the window. And Rachel, seeing her sister Leah praising the Lord with 4 sons of her own, takes it upon herself to try to fix the situation without seeking counsel from the Lord. Even the names that she gives to these 2 sons are Dan, which means judge, as if she's saying that God is judging between her and her sister, and Naphtali, which means wrestling, as if she's in this competition against her sister. She's trying to better her sister in the flesh. Even the name that she uses for God in verse 6 is Elohim. It's not Jehovah. Her outward form of spirituality is not personal because she's just in her flesh. Just as much as the unbeliever uses the name God. God blessed me. You know, I hate it when I try to fix a bad situation in my flesh. according to my own devices. I remember I actually told someone who I wasn't getting along with, the Lord told me that I'm supposed to love you, so I'm trying, okay? And without thinking about it, what I was telling them is that I hated them, and it made the matter worse. And Rachel has this bright idea that her handmaid will bear children for her since she's unable to. And these handmaids are treated like slaves, really. They have no say-so in the matter. They have to do as their mistress says, and Bilhah is not even allowed to name her own natural children. They're considered to be Rachel's sons and not hers, not Bilhah's. I think that this position of a handmaid gives us a greater sense of the humility of Mary, the mother of Jesus. When the angel had appeared unto her and told her that she was to be with child, a child that was not going to be from the loins of Joseph, her espoused husband, it reads in Luke 1:38, and Mary said, Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word. And the angel departed from her. I think that these two sisters in our story, they could have learned a great deal from the character of Mary. In verse 9 it reads, When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, A troop cometh. And she called his name Gad. Maybe she was thinking by now, we've got a whole army over here, Rachel, and it's going to be me and my boys against you and your boys. And if you notice, Leah is no longer praising the Lord for her sons either. She's just fully engaged in this battle between herself and Rachel. Verse 12, And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Asher means happy. But this happiness, again, is coming from her approval, or her supposed approval, from the other women that she's able to produce another son. And she's not looking for the approval of Jehovah. Verse 14, And Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Now, Reuben must have been a small child still at this time. Remember, this is all happening within the next 7-year period that Jacob is serving Laban again for Rachel. I think that the first 4 boys from Leah must have been born one right after another. And then these other sons were probably overlapping the time, and these 3 women were probably all carrying children or in pregnancy all at the same time. These mandrakes that Reuben had brought home to his mother were believed in these times to have magical medicinal powers. The mandrake root, it looks a little bit like a carrot, but it's more of a brown root than an orange root. The mandrake was believed to be a stimulus, for one, and then also it was believed to give fertility to the barren womb. So then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes, hoping this would help her to have a son like all the other women. And Leah said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken away my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. So she's cutting a deal for these mandrakes. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. I imagine that Jacob is getting a kick out of all these women making such a fuss over him. It's really feeding his ego, I'm sure. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived, and bare Jacob a fifth son. So it seems like the mandrakes, they worked, but not for Rachel, for Leah. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. And afterwards she bare a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Now, who would have ever thought that this was the beginning of the birth of a whole nation, and a godly nation at that? These women are out of control. But such would be any house with 4 wives, and all of them want as many sons as possible. Leah had 2 more sons, and she names them Issachar and Zebulun. Issachar is the 9th son of Jacob, and the 5th by Leah. His name means there is recompense, or he brings wages. I believe that she was thinking that all of her many sons will be such a financial blessing to Jacob that now he must desire to dwell with me. And the name Zebulun means exalted, which was the last son that Leah had borne unto Jacob. There is a mention of one daughter also from Leah, and her name is Dinah. She's a key figure in another story coming up, so she gets a mention here with all of these sons. But the girls wouldn't be mentioned in the genealogy in these times, since the sons were so much more valued to the fathers of this ancient culture than the daughters were. Which means that there could have been other daughters also. They just weren't mentioned by name. And I think there probably were other daughters. That's a lot of children. Say there's only one daughter, that's pretty tough. In verse 22, it reads, And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. After all this, God opened Rachel's womb. And she conceived, and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, The Lord shall add to me another son. The name Joseph means Jehovah has added. And Jehovah is the personal name of God. Rachel seems to have drawn closer to the Lord in her barrenness. She goes from Elohim to Jehovah in her praise. And she has a much greater elevated praise now when God blesses the fruit of her womb. Verse 25, And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go. For thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Which means that Jacob had served his full term. It's been 14 years since he met Rachel by the well of fresh water. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, or stay with me still. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. And Laban said, Appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. God has blessed you, man, and you've been a blessing to me all the while you have been in my house. That's quite a compliment. But I think that the compliment goes to the Lord. Verse 29, And Jacob said unto him, Thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now, when shall I provide for mine own house also? I want to break free from you, Laban. I just wanted Rachel, and I would have been on my way. But indeed, I do have a whole troop of sons and wives and children now. Verse 31, and Laban said, what shall I give thee? Come on, stay with me. And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. I don't want anything from you. But if thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. And he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked or striped and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his own sons. And he set 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So Jacob agreed to stay. He's actually going to stay altogether 20 years. So it's just going to be 6 more years. But the deal was that Jacob was to have all the striped, speckled, and spotted goats and all of the black sheep. They're mentioned as brown sheep here. And Laban would have all the rest of the plain goats and the white sheep. And the increase of the flocks would now be divided by their markings, which means that the increase of Jacob's wages would become a natural thing rather than the decision of Laban or of Jacob. And so Laban agrees to this. Probably because most of the flocks were plain goats and white sheep. But even those that were speckled and spotted, he separates them out right there on the spot, and he sends them away to further pastures with his own sons, along with any black sheep. And so Jacob gets to start from scratch. Jacob stays and tends to Laban's flocks, beginning with all plain goats and all white sheep. Actually, he gets nothing right off the bat. But now it's in the hands of the Lord. Verse 37, and Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of hazel and chestnut tree, and pilled white strakes in them. So he cut these white stripes into these tree branches, or where it says rods, and made the white appear which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had pilled before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and he set the face of the flocks toward the ring-straked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and he put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and men servants, and camels, and donkeys. The Lord gave him the increase. Now, this method of breeding livestock that Jacob is using here seems to be as if he's waving a magic wand before all the flocks and he's getting all the strong cattle for himself. That would be the striped and the speckled and the spotted goats and all of the black sheep for himself also. And then all of the plain goats and the white sheep that were going into Laban's animal pens, well, they were weak. Laban was getting the runts of the litter, or the livestock that wasn't as strong and healthy as Jacob's flocks were. And you know that Laban is so greedy that his blood is probably boiling during this whole process. I imagine that there was a lot of tension in this relationship now between Laban and Jacob. And you might ask, how did Jacob get the better flocks just by placing these striped rods before their eyes? This is kind of weird, don't you think? And I read in one commentary that Jacob had excellent breeding skills. And while that might be true, I think that this bounty of blessing that was filling all the animal pens of Jacob went far beyond the skills of Jacob. I believe that the Lord was blessing Jacob because God had promised to bless Jacob. I think Jacob could have walked away from Laban empty-handed with his wives and children, and God would have used another method to bless Jacob. The blessing of the Lord would have come from somewhere else. I honestly think that Jacob is still trying to be a little crafty here. He's dividing up the healthy flock from the weak flock, or the weaker flocks. And God is still blessing him. And he is blessed of the Lord. Now I say this because Jacob is the picture of an imperfect man who's being blessed of the Lord, in spite of his imperfections, which should encourage all of us, really. Jacob is not the standard of moral perfection, and neither are you or I. But God will still bless our lives so that everyone around us might see that the blessing of the Lord is resting upon us. The blessing is on the one that God has chosen for himself rather than through the schemings of men. You know, I get bugged by blatantly dishonest Christians. I get bothered by irresponsible Christians and unloving Christians also. Those things bug me. But I can't deny, nor would I even want to deny, that there is no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. None. There is a certain blessing that rests upon the head of all of God's sons and daughters. And it might not come in a monetary form like it was here with Jacob, but the blessing of the indwelling Spirit of God is a much better possession than just a flock of sheep or a herd of goats. Much better. Jacob still needed to grow in his character, and so do we. But Jacob was already blessed of the Lord, and so are we.